I was born October 8th, 1935, in Fort Worth, Texas, but I grew up in Monterey, California. That is to say, I grew up there after we arrived, having been some other places first. But yes, that's where I grew up. I was probably between 3 and 4 when we moved from Texas. And I remember some of that trip. And I remember a great deal about where we went, what we did, things like that. When we left Texas, we went first to Cody, Wyoming, and we stayed there for probably a little over a year. Then we moved to Billings, Montana, where I started to school. At that point, I was between 5 and 6. In fact, I started to school at 6, having not been to kindergarten. And then to California in 1942, and Monterey in 1943. So in a span of roughly 4 years, we were really on the move, as the title of the book suggests. We moved from Fort Worth to Cody for a couple of different reasons. One was economics. We're talking about 1938, 39, in that neighborhood. And despite the fact that the Depression was so-called over, and we were in the interregnum between the world wars, black people weren't doing all that well economically. When my parents got married in 1934, my dad was earning $14 a week. And one of the stories in my family is that my mom went to her mother and said, "Hey, do you think that we'll manage this new couple on this salary of $14 a week?" Because that sounded pretty good to her. But that's where they were. So economics was one driver. Another driver was race. I mean, black life in Texas wasn't all that comfortable in a lot of ways. In fact, one story I tell in the book is about how my parents were discriminated against and harassed racially, which was a kind of matter of course. My dad, they were stopped on the road. My dad was hauled off to town, to jail. The police left my mother in the car. They harassed him by threatening to try him for assaulting a white woman. The old tried and true race baiting issue. And this was not true, of course, and by the time the woman that they claimed had been assaulted by my father said, "No, this isn't the guy. This is somebody I had never seen before," they took whatever money my dad had and put him out on the street and made him walk back to his car and hitchhike back to his car. So they were trying to get rid of some of that stuff. Another thing was that my dad's brother had run away to Wyoming to become a cowboy. And he had been gone from Fort Worth for about 4 years. Nobody had heard from him. He wrote us a postcard back to my dad saying, "Hey, Rudy, come out here. I'll get you a job on this ranch where I work," right? And so my dad, being good friends with his older brother, said, "Hey, this sounds like a good deal. I think I'll go out there and be a cowboy too." So they packed up, my mother and me and my brother, and headed to Wyoming in the winter, I think of that 1938. So all these things tended to sort of coalesce at one point, and opportunity knocked. They took it. Over the years, I've told my students that I was the only black man in America who was qualified to be president because I'd had the Abraham Lincoln log cabin experience, right? And I said that and teased them that way because we in fact did live in a log cabin on the banks of the Shoshone River outside of Cody, Wyoming. Um, my father worked um, shining shoes. He worked in a car dealership. He worked in a bakery. And was able to make a living doing this kind of stuff. At the same time, we lived a lot off the land. I mean, they had a garden. We raised critters. My father hunted and fished, so we ate wild game and wild fish, and we made life. On the social side, there was discrimination in Wyoming, just like there'd been in Texas, but not so much. And it wasn't, I think, because anybody loved anybody any more or less than they did in Texas. It was because everybody there had to scramble. Everybody there had to struggle to make life. So you didn't have much time or energy to be struggling about race when everybody was struggling to get enough to eat. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of thing that happened. On the social end, my parents, who were deeply religious, Pentecostals, worshipped with a white Pentecostal bunch. And part of why we ultimately left Cody was social and racial around the church, namely the Assemblies of God group, which is the one they were attached to, so liked my father and his preaching. He was already becoming a minister, that they wanted to fire their pastor and have my dad become their pastor. And neither my father nor my mother was ready for that. For a young black preacher from Texas to take over a white congregation in Wyoming just wouldn't fly. So they ran, and they ended up in Billings, Montana, where he started a congregation of mixed race folks, black, red. I mean, there were Native Americans, there were Mexicans, there were some white folks in his congregation. So it was a very mixed kind of world. And that, I think, is one of the things that distinguishes racial life in the West by contrast with what you see in other parts of the country. That is to say, folks have to get on with each other because that's who's there, you know. Folks have to work together because they need help. Folks go to church together because everybody can't have his own little tiny church, you know, I mean, that kind of stuff. So people got to places and did things that might not have happened in Alabama or, you know, Georgia or wherever. I remember one time we went to the rodeo, and as we went through the audience in the stands to where we were going to sit to watch the show, people started making race remarks. Ooh, dark clouds, it's gonna rain, look out. And I remember my parents being very uptight and my dad very angry at this kind of behavior because it wasn't uncommon for whites to be fairly direct and open with their racism. In Billings, where I started to school, my first day in school, I experienced an exceedingly painful racial experience. I got to school, and when the teacher asked us who could read, I raised my hand. I was the only kid who did, and I was the only black kid in the class. Turns out, I was indeed the only kid who knew how to read already, because I didn't know, and I still don't, when I learned how to read or how I came about learning to read. All I know is that I read. And instead of encouraging me or supporting me, that teacher punished me because I knew how to read and and couldn't explain how I had learned it. And as I said, I was the only one who knew how to read. So she made me sit in the back of the class on a high stool with a dunce hat as my reward for being the only kid in the class who knew how to read. So I remember that. So I remembered some things because I was old enough by then, 5, 6 years old. I could remember quite distinctly what aspects of life were comfortable and which ones weren't. There may have been aspects of life in Cody or Billings that were segregated, but I didn't see it. By that I mean I never had the sense that we had to live in any particular place based on race. That was clear in San Francisco, that here's where black folks lived, in the Fillmore and the Bayview. And, God, once the Giants came to town, Willie Mays tried to buy a house near where my grandparents ultimately bought a house, and folks wouldn't sell it to him on the basis of race. And there was a big mess and a big fol-de-rol and, this and that. So it was there that I first saw segregation de facto, not legally, but de facto. Ironically, I should have seen it some in the church, right? When my parents couldn't handle the notion of pastoring a white congregation, and the fact that the church in Cody had so few folks of color. I mean, there'd be an occasional Mexican. I never saw an Indian in that group that I remember, and I never saw any other black people other than my family. Whereas in Billings, we saw Indian folks. Our next door neighbors were Indians. Mexican folks who came to my dad's church. White ones came. So there was a much clearer mixture of folks involved in my life. And I guess that's part of what distinguishes Western life for me, and that is that, in the last 20 years even, I could go to places in the South and Midwest and in the East even, and not even have to deal with white people very often. I'd see them in a distance. I'd know they were there, but we didn't have to deal with them. I could live in a black world that had everything that I needed and that didn't require me to interact much with other than black folks. That's impossible out here, except for maybe some areas in the LA, San Diego nexus, in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe around Denver or Phoenix, right? But that's very unusual here in the West. Here you've got to take them as they come because there isn't anybody else there, right? So you take them as they come. And I think that it's easy for a kid as I was to start to see that, right? When I was 14, 15, my mother's aunt's husband was dying of cancer, and my folks wanted us to see him again before he died. And they sent us to Fort Worth to visit him. We went down on the train, and my father, not wanting us to have to deal with segregation in the trains, bought tickets for us in Monterey and ticketed us there, so our tickets took us down there and back, and we never had to deal, we thought. When it came time to seat us on the train, this is coming back to California because we'd ridden down in a car. we went onto the train and went to where our seats were designated on our tickets. And like I said, I was about 14, and Dan, my brother, was about 12. And we sat down. A conductor came down the aisle and he said, "Boys, who sat you here?" And we said, "Well, this person over here told us this is where we're supposed to sit. Here are our tickets." He said, "Oh, there's been a mistake. You're not supposed to be here." And he took us to the segregated car. And we rode in the segregated car out to El Paso from Fort Worth. So we rode from Fort Worth to El Paso in the segregated car. And at El Paso, we changed trains and cars, and that disappeared. We got home, and my dad just blew a gasket. He went straight down to the station, negotiated with these folks, got some of his money back, got a written apology, but we'd had the experience, and so he didn't go to black folks in Monterey to deal with the ticket stuff because the folks who sold the tickets were white, right? In Texas, the conductor who moved us out of the integrated cars into segregated cars was white, but he moved us away from integration into segregation in the, quote, colored car. So we had those kinds of experiences both in the West where we lived and away from it where we went. There were huge numbers of African Americans who moved to the West before and after the First World War and between the wars, during the Second World War. Literally thousands and thousands of black folks came. I don't think that many folks took the kind of circuitous route we took. And I don't think many folks did it when we did it. I think my parents were a little bit ahead of the waves of migration between the wars. And I think that after we were here in the West, we could see just huge numbers of black folks come. When we came to this town, the first day I was in this town, I stopped at an intersection downtown at the corner of 5th and Capitol for a signal light. Some young guys drove by in a pickup and saw me sitting there in this little blue Volkswagen Bug. And this dude rolled down his window and shouted out the window, "Go home, nigger!" I looked at my wife and I said, "Well, we're home. We know where we are. We understand who's here, right?" But it was unusual to see many black folks when we first came. But we're talking 1970, right? In that 40-some years between then and now, there are so many black folks who've come to this town, so many Asian folks, particularly Southeast Asians. Indians were already here. There have been so many Hispanics who've come that it's clear that the waves of migration have continued and have made the region and the area much more diverse than it was when we came. I think that if my book is at all successful, what it does and will do is demonstrate the general through the particular. In other words, the individual experiences of this family represent black experience in America writ small. And by looking at the small picture, one can infer things about the bigger one. So I'm hoping that as folks read this book, they will come to understand how this single family in its various branches and offshoots and so forth represents a much bigger bunch of folks than just the family. That's, I hope, what the book does.